Good morning, people. Okay, or afternoon when I send this out, probably. Um, okay, so this just basically covers to the end of Hamlet for you. As I say, I'm going to pick out some kind of key bits, but there'll be other bits you can talk about. This is just about giving you a kind of good overall idea of what's happening, being able to talk about the kind of transition within Hamlet as a character at this point in the play, so that you could approach any extract from it and hopefully draw out points, and you can use it to debate around. Okay, so we're going to look at today. We need to consider how kind of Machiavelli can come into this. So you need to do a bit of research around Machiavelli because Hamlet's actions at the end of the play have been kind of linked to a kind of more Machiavellian point of view, essentially. Um, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are gone from the narrative, but within the kind of close of the play, we have the figure of Osric who kind of replaces them. We want to kind of consider how he functions, what Shakespeare's using him for. And we need to keep an eye on kind of comparing Hamlet now to how he was in earlier scenes of the play. Okay, so Hamlet has kind of transitioned, he's changed. In this closing scene, he has become this kind of man of action, and that's kind of important. Horatio at the end, he doesn't, unlike some of Shakespeare's other characters, kind of carry this through, but he does kind of suggest potentially taking his own life along with the death of Hamlet. And we can kind of link that into other Shakespearean plays and think about, well, why does Shakespeare do this very often with characters in his plays? So the first thing I want you to do, I want you to spend kind of 10 minutes or so doing some brief research around Machiavelli. You want to be looking for kind of just who he is in a more general sense. I would also really, I think it's quite useful to have a look at some of his kind of quotations that people have taken and sort of see as key from him. I don't necessarily recommend you read his whole kind of book, The Prince, or anything like that. It's not the most thrilling read, but there are certain kind of key bits that are very important within it. It's important to know when you're looking at it, Shakespeare probably wouldn't have directly read Machiavelli. There's no English translation of it at Shakespeare's time, but other people have read it. Those kind of ideas have kind of transmitted themselves into government. They've transmitted themselves into the kind of common cultural mindset. So even if he's never actually directly read him, he will have been affected by the ideas of him as an author. So yeah, don't get too tied up around that. So pause me, have a look, see what information you can kind of pick out around him, and we'll be kind of linking back into that as we go into the narrative. Okay, so in relation to kind of Machiavelli, he's a kind of political thinker from Italy, and he kind of pushes forward the view that basically men are predisposed to deceive each other, and that you need to be aware that you're probably being manipulated. He talks about the kind of best ways to govern essentially, and he says that, well, you get the it's better to be feared than loved. He basically says that if you want to get something done, the morality around it doesn't really matter as long as you kind of achieve the aim you set out to do. You can hurt people, you can, certain people need to be sacrificed in order to achieve goals. He's kind of widely credited with the kind of the end justifies the means, although he doesn't say it in quite those terms. And he talks about other things. If you look at the kind of key quotations from him, if an injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance need not be feared. So basically, if you're going to injure somebody, you need to make sure that you really hurt them so that they can't hurt you back. Never was anything great achieved without danger. Dun, dun, dun. There is no avoiding war. It can only be postponed to the advantage of others. You know, he makes these kind of statements, these practical statements about governing, about living. Now, in many ways, Hamlet up to this point has been indecisive. He's been not really following Machiavelli's advice, but various critics have kind of noted that in the closing scenes of the play, he becomes more kind of Machiavellian himself. And he kind of, there's a harshness about Hamlet and an action around him that has not been present before. So if we look at of Act 5, Scene 2, we get this bit. Sorry, I just had to check the right line reference. This is around about line 57, 58, depending on different versions. So just have a dead quick read through it, and then I'll kind of go through. And to say this is just a bit that I'm picking out. This is a wider pattern we see in Hamlet's behaviour across the closing scene. Okay. Now, in terms of this, what Hamlet is obviously talking about is kind of essentially he's indirectly murdered Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He's forged this letter to the English king. And he said he should put those bearers put to sudden death, no shriving time allowed. So he sent them off to their death. But there's something cold and calculated about him now. He's taken action against them, but he says they are not near my conscience. So he's going to work around metaphor here. There's the negation. They're not near his conscience. Now, we would maybe expect with a murder for him to feel kind of guilt or remorse, but he's clearly distancing himself from this here. And he places the kind of focus onto them. Their defeat does by their own insinuation grow. So their deaths are their own fault. They deserve their death because they have essentially betrayed him. 'Tis dangerous when the baser nature comes between the pass and fell incensed points of mighty opposites. So he's basically saying they came between me and my revenge on Claudius. He is now seeing himself in a kind of different way. Whereas before he was kind of comparing himself to Hercules and saying he's not like Hercules at all in any way. Now we get this kind of idea of himself as one of these mighty opposites against Claudius, and they in the middle as kind of insignificant. They are the baser natures in this kind of wider metaphor, and he and Claudius the mighty opposites. And Horatio's kind of, shocked by the king's behaviour, that he would, have sent Hamlet out to die, essentially. And again, we see this transition in Hamlet. Does it not, thinkest thee, stand me now upon? So he's sort of questioning Horatio here. Don't you think that I'm in the right now? And he kind of builds up his reasoning once again that he's done at various points. He that hath killed my king and whored my mother, popped in between the election and my hopes. So Claudius has killed his father, has kind of corrupted his mother, whored his mother, popped in between the elections and my hopes. So he's taken Hamlet's kind of position. He sees that he should have been king, is the implication here. Claudius has come between the election and what he's hoped out of it. Thrown out his angle for my proper life. So he's tried to kill him, is sort of the implication here. And with such cousinage, so with deception. So he's recognising Claudius's deception as well, that he's a deceiver. And he then rhetorically questions, is it not perfect conscience? Can I not kill this man in perfect conscience? He's not worried about the moral implications anymore. He's kind of cleansed of that. So he's now able to kind of serve justice upon those who are kind of deserving of it. It's very much like Machiavelli. He is recognizing the kind of potential deceptions around him. He himself is kind of being vicious, and he's kind of unworried by his conscience to achieve his aims here. Now, this is something you can pick up on across the rest of the scene. Think about where you get this kind of decisive, very Machiavellian Hamlet. You should, in theory, be able to kind of look at all those kind of quotes from Machiavelli, see where Hamlet embodies those kind of aspects at various points. He has become far more kind of Machiavellian throughout this scene. Right, in terms of other things we want to look at Osric, okay? Now, you get this exchange with Osric. He comes on around about line 67, and to Osric, a courtier, and he kind of talks with Hamlet and Horatio for a while. One thing to note here that's kind of interesting, in the start of the scene, Hamlet is talking in blank verse. When Osric comes on, he switches back to prose again, as he's kind of mocking him, essentially. Now, with Osric, he's in many ways like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He's a flatterer, he's a court hanger-on, pardon me, and Shakespeare is kind of critiquing figures like him. So, Hamlet here, and this is what you're kind of looking out for in a minute, how is Hamlet kind of mocking him? How is he kind of disdaining him, creating a sense of him as being quite vapid, empty, that he's a worthless individual, essentially. And yeah, it's essentially Shakespeare attacking not just Osric, but all figures like this, these social climbers, these people who are, will do anything to get to the top, these kind of brown nosers, essentially. Right, okay, so in terms of Osric, what I want you to do, you're going to use, from his kind of entrance, sort of around about line 67, 68, and kind of follow the discourse through. And what I want you to do is identify where exactly he's kind of undermined. What kind of bits would you pick out from this that you could use to show how Shakespeare is using him for this kind of wider criticism? I would have thought, given that's only about 100 lines, probably going to take you about 10-15 minutes to kind of pick out various bits from it, maybe a bit longer than that. Remember, you're using the kind of no fear Shakespeare, things like that, to help you along the way, and use the notes there in your books. Okay, so the first thing to notice is kind of aside to Horatio, dost thou know this waterfly? So obviously it's metaphorical, it diminishes Osric, it suggests he's kind of something superficial, something trivial within it. And he suggests that it is a vice to know him. So simply to know him is something bad, it's going to hurt you. And he suggests the only reason that Osric is there at court is not for any intellect, not for anything else. He hath much land and fertile. So the only reason he's there is that he's been gifted land through his family, and that's it. And he says, let a beast be lord of beasts, and his crib shall stand at the king's mess. So again, it's all about kind of diminishing him, referring to him in kind of that kind of bestial sense. And where it kind of says he's spacious in the possession of dirt, he owns a wide kind of land in terms of the dirt. It can also be a kind of insult to him. It's kind of double meaning potentially, and he's not very clever. He has nothing to him but dirt. It's all kind of out of vanity. You then get the kind of the amusing exchange where, as you look at it, and I'll just pick out a couple of key bits, your bonnet to its right use, and where he's kind of saying, oh, it's very hot and it's sort of very cold. and he sort of, I beseech you, remember. He's referring to the hat again, like he did with Polonius earlier on with the clouds, saying, "Oh, it looks like this. No, it looks like this. No, it looks like this." He's getting him to take his hat off and on and off and on and off and on, because Osric is desperate to please Hamlet as the kind of the heir. So Hamlet is able to show just how fawning he is and make him look a fool. Now, it depends, and this is something you comment on in different adaptations. It depends on the different adaptation as to how resentful Osric is about this, how much he kind of picks up on how he's being mocked or not. In the Tennant version, it's quite clear he's aware of how he's being mocked and he's becoming frustrated by it. In other versions, he retains that kind of fawning flattery through it. As you kind of go further through, Hamlet kind of mocks Osric's style of talking. So Hamlet, whilst he's speaking in prose, kind of overly elevates his kind of style of talking. So if you look around kind of line 98 to line 106, I take him to be the soul of a great article, and his infusion of such dearth and rareness as to make true diction of him, his semblance in his mirror. All of this is deliberately kind of hyperbolic. He's mocking the kind of fawning aspect of Osric here. And whilst Osric is kind of forced to agree, your lordship speaks most infallibly of him. He's, again, it depends on the adaptation, but he's being mocked here. Hamlet is kind of picking him apart and playing with him. Hamlet kind of picks him apart in other ways. So as you kind of go further through, I'm looking around about kind of line 128 now. What's his weapon? Rapier and dagger. That's two weapons, but well. So he's kind of deliberately nitpicking on Osric's dialogue as well here. And you can pick out other bits alongside this, but if you were to get this as an extract, you would want to be talking about the way he kind of undermines him, the kind of veiled hostility of the narrative. And when Osric exits, Horatio refers to him as this kind of as a lapwing. He's again turned into an animal, something kind of showy again, as part of it. Yeah, sorry, and the final bit to note from it, Hamlet suggests this is not just Osric. Dun, 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 dun. He's only got the tune of the time. This is about line 170, and he's basically saying, well, Osric is just like many others. It's become the fashion of the time, and that this is something kind of, it's diminishing culture essentially. So this bit is the kind of attack on those kind of social climbers. Okay. Then what we get, and this is our kind of main next point. There's a few other points to kind of run alongside this, but the main focus you want here is the kind of the way that Hamlet is kind of changed and altered in these closing scenes of the play. So they're important. They show Hamlet in his kind of transition from the man of indecision to the man of action. The duel itself is kind of symbolic. You can even refer to it as kind of phallic in many ways. It's this with rapiers. So very often Shakespeare uses the sword as a kind of symbol in terms of sort of phallic symbol even. You make kind of jokes around it. But it's showing him actively fighting. He's sort of a figure on stage in kind of more militaristic action at this point as well. Okay, and he's kind of actively opposing those who stand against him. And his words. So whereas before, throughout the play, we've had a very kind of questioning tone with Hamlet, Now we've got this kind of change. He's become more certain, and he's lost that kind of questioning intonation. There's, a lot of imperative language use, very strong declaratives, and again, other physical actions that go alongside these. And he actually, through this scene, when he's talking to Laertes, he casts off his madness. And in terms of the way he does this, it does suggest that his madness is in many ways kind of a device that has allowed him to write off his morally dubious acts. It's kind of protected him from being viewed as kind of morally corrupt himself. These were acts of madness. You can't blame me for my time of madness. I'm sane now. Kind of forgive me. So you're using the whole of kind of to the end of the play here. And there are various kind of things I want you to look for alongside the change in Hamlet. So the first thing is the change in Hamlet. So how is he depicted as decisive in his words, in his actions, other points? You also need to look out for kind of Laertes. Now, as we were talking about him last time as a kind of foil character for Hamlet, his uncertainty, he's there essentially to murder Hamlet, but he's depicted as kind of changing, as growing more uncertain at this point. And you want to be able to kind of talk around that. You want to be able to talk around Claudius. So Claudius at the end here is depicted as kind of cruel and callous, and it means that Hamlet's murder of him is, it becomes more legitimate again. We're kind of reminded of Claudius's selfishness. As you come towards the close of the scene, you want to be looking at the way in which both Horatio and Fortinbras, when he enters, kind of eulogize Hamlet, and how, again, that reinforces the transition within him, and kind of heightens the sense of tragedy around Hamlet's death here. Okay, now this will take you a while to go through and to do properly, to look at each of these in different ways. I would suggest that kind of you give it an initial read through, and then you spend at least 10 minutes on each of those, kind of collecting together kind of key quotations that will go with it, and then I'll kind of pick out some of the most useful ones potentially, or the ones I find most useful anyway, but there'll be other bits that you could talk about here. So pause me for a while, use those as kind of your key things you're looking for, and pick out as much evidence as you can around each of them, okay? And then I'll go through each in turn. Right, okay. So I'm just going to go through this kind of chronologically. I'm not going to skip backwards and forwards with the different ones here. I'm just going to kind of pick it out in order. So if we go to around about line 186, 187 in mine, you've got the setting up of the duel, and Horatio says, "You'll lose." But Hamlet's response to this, again, shows this transition. I do not think so. His utterance here is short, it's kind of decisive. Since he went into France, I've been in continual practice. So here is kind of adjective choice, continual. He's been working at this. We haven't necessarily seen it on stage, but he does suggest that he has been kind of training hard. I shall win at the odds. So his modal verbs, as we come into this closing section, are important. He shall win. We get a lot of kind of decisive and certain kind of modals towards the end here. And whilst Horatio potentially doubts at this stage, there is a kind of certainty within Hamlet. If we skip a little bit kind of further on, the bit that starts, not a whit. We defy augury. There is special providence even in the fall of a sparrow. So Hamlet, who's been worried about all these kind of metaphysical kind of questions earlier on. He's now again very kind of decisive sounding. These are short utterances, not a wit. We defy augury. So he defies these predictions. He's kind of presenting himself as kind of, going against. There is special providence in the fall of a sparrow. So he's simply saying, let what will be. If it's kind of biblical allusion here, that God is interfering in the affairs of the world, and God is sort of working through him here potentially. And he's kind of, again, whereas before he's been very worried about the future, his kind of discourse here suggests he's no longer worried, with this kind of series of conditional clauses. If it be, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it is not now, yet it will come. Again, it's sort of, he's discarding, he's not worried about the future. The kind of suggestion is here, the readiness in all. So he's simply saying, I just need to be ready for whatever happens. The readiness is all. It kind of touches on hyperbole, but it does show him kind of discarding the future and simply being ready to act. He's in a state of readiness. And the final kind of bit, let be, his kind of imperative utterance at the end here, again, suggests that sense of certainty that comes after. We then have the kind of setting up of the duel, and Hamlet kind of apologizing essentially to Laertes. Now, this bit is important in kind of starting to draw out the changes in Hamlet. It starts to create potentially that doubt in Laertes more than has been there before as well. It depends on how this is played. This can be played in a very kind of contained, aggressive way, where Laertes is kind of only for the show of the court, kind of accepting the apology, but it can be done in a slightly more genuine way. Hamlet here, this is about line 219. Free me so far in your generous thoughts that I've shot my arrow over the house and hurt my brother. So, A, it's imperative. Again, it adds to that decisive flavour in Hamlet. But B, it's a kind of apology to Laertes. The kind of metaphor of the arrow suggests that, he's shot his bow without really realising what was on the other side. He's not shot it with any intention of doing harm, and the harm has only come indirectly. He's wounded his brother. As I say, depends how it's played, but Laertes does appear to accept Hamlet's apology, to reconcile with him. But all that time I do receive your offered love like love, and will not wrong it. So there, as I say, there's a seeming reconciliation. As we go in with the duel itself, I'll be your foil, Laertes. We talked about him as a kind of stage foil here. It's his opposite here. He'll be his opposite. Foils are also a type of sword. But again, it's that certainty. I will be your foil. The modal verb is coming in there again. It's showing a sense of certainty. In mine ignorance, your skill shall, like a star in the darkest night, stick fiery off indeed. So Laertes does think he's being mocked here, but and you can play it more as a mocking exchange. But there's, again, that certainty coming through it. There's a self-assurance within Hamlet's discourse at this point. Where's the next bit we'll kind of pick out? Simply the fact that Hamlet wins the first couple of rounds of the duel is important. That a hit, a very palpable hit, and another hit. So we see Hamlet in kind of control here. He's in control of the duel, and again, depends on your version how you play this out. It can be that this is hard fought, or you can have Hamlet, almost playing with Laertes, really his skill outshining Laertes by a long way. The next bit we'll come to and we'll talk about is Claudius. As you get to kind of about line 270, Gertrude, do not drink. I will, my lord. I pray you pardon. It is the poison cup. It is too late. Which is an aside. So to protect himself, because he's poisoned the cup, Claudius is depicted allowing Gertrude to die. Now, this is important because Gertrude is one of the kind of supposed factors in leading him to want the crown in the first place. And he here is kind of sacrificing her for his own kind of gain, essentially. He reveals only as an aside, not publicly, that the wine is poisoned to protect himself. Laertes' aside is also important as you kind of go further down, and yet it is almost against my conscience. Laertes is saying, I'm going to, hit Hamlet now, I will cut him, and it's almost against his conscience. So within that, it suggests a growing uncertainty. It's an aside kind of revealing this to us. It doesn't stop him, but it's because it's only almost against my conscience, but it does suggest the creeping sense of doubt coming in. And as he looks at his own actions, once this exchange has taken place, we're now skipping to about line 292. He says to Osric, I am justly killed with mine own treachery. So the swords have been swapped, and he now sees his own actions as treacherous. They've moved from being an act of revenge, an act of justice that he's depicted them as earlier, and now he kind of doubts their own motivations. They've become a treacherous act. As we go further through, she swoons to see them bleed. And Claudius again here, we, through the dramatic irony, are aware that he has poisoned the cup. It's been kind of revealed to us, but he's still being depicted in that state of deception. He's well aware that she's not swooning at the sight of blood. So we see his discourse as deceptive. Gertrude seeks to reveal this as the implication. She too is kind of atoning here. Sorry, I'm going quite quick. I know you might have to kind of listen back on this, but never mind. Again, think with Gertrude at this stage, she can be kind of played out here as essentially doing this purposefully, especially if you watch ones like the Tennant version where there's the seeming awareness that the wine has been poisoned and it becomes an act of self-sacrifice to prevent Hamlet from drinking it, that she does it. So she seeks then to place blame onto Claudius. No, the drink, I am poisoned. And oh my dear Hamlet, as her kind of dying words kind of pledge her devotion to her son. You then get Laertes is the one who kind of reveals the king's treachery. So again, with Laertes' kind of doubts, his uncertainty, his revealing of the truth, and he is the one who essentially to the court reveals Claudius's kind of part in this, becomes important. Thy mother's poisoned, I can no more, the king's to blame. Now, in Hamlet's kind of actions then at this point, you get again the decisive element to it, then venom to thy work. The venom itself is kind of personified. He's imperatively ordering it. And whereas before he's kind of kept the kind of insults and challenges internally, he now, in his killing of Claudius, openly reveals this. Hear, thou incestuous damned Dane. And the adjective choices kind of demean Claudius. You get that kind of plosive sound on it, damned Dane, to kind of create that violent, insulting tone to it. And again, the imperative use, drink of this potion, is the union there, follow my mother. So there is that level of kind of certainty within it. You then get that again, if it's been played out as kind of false earlier, we get the true reconciliation with Laertes then at this point, again, heightening that kind of the uncertainty that's, come into Laertes. Exchange forgiveness with me, noble Hamlet. So the epithet for Hamlet here, noble Hamlet. He's no longer the kind of villain that Laertes has depicted him as in Act 4. He has kind of transformed. Now, as we come right towards the end here, you get kind of, and we'll talk about this slightly more detail in a moment, but Horatio's kind of closing words, or just before Hamlet kind of dies, never believe it, I'm more an antique Roman than a Dane, here's yet some liquor left, where he's considering suicide himself here, the noble Roman suicide, I'm more the Roman than the Dane. But this feeds into Hamlet as decisive at the end. One of Hamlet's final acts, as thou art a man, give me the cup, let go, by heaven, I'll have it. His kind of final physical act is to prevent Horatio from killing himself. He seizes the cup, probably spills the rest of the wine that's left, poisoned. And again, Hamlet acting, Hamlet decisively doing something here at the end. Again, laced with those modal verbs and those kind of imperatives as he goes through it. His dying words too are important. We hear Fortinbras appearing in the distance, and Hamlet's kind of dying words, on Fortinbras, he has my dying voice. He's basically saying, I would have voted for Fortinbras to be king, so he has his dying voice. Hamlet's got power, even in death, to decide the future of Denmark, and he acts on this, he makes use of it. His actions will affect the future of Denmark. And then we're just onto that kind of eulogizing, essentially. Now cracks a noble heart, good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. So the noble heart, it can either be that kind of Horatio's referring to himself, his own heart breaking at the death of Hamlet. It can be Hamlet dying as the kind of noble heart that is cracking. So the metaphor either way evokes a tragedy around Hamlet's death. He's referred to here as kind of sweet prince. There is the reference almost back to Hamlet's soliloquy from earlier, in this sleep of death, what dreams may come. And here Horatio, good night, sweet prince. So Hamlet kind of into the sleep of death, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. So within these kind of eulogizing final words, suggesting a holy Christian kind of burial, essentially. Fortinbras, and this will be the last bit we kind of point out from this bit, he gets the closing dialogue of the play, and he says, "Let 4 captains bear Hamlet like a soldier to the stage, for he was likely, had he be put on, to have proved most royal." And the suggestion here is kind of key. Hamlet, who has been kind of emasculated earlier on, has not been a man of action, has not kind of followed his father in that kind of warlike aspect, is now depicted as a soldier in death. And visually on stage, he's kind of carried out by 4 military captains, and this kind of is striking to us. Right, so closing bits here. The kind of have a quick research round now. Find where Shakespeare has other kind of servants dying alongside their masters at the end of plays. Think about why he might do this, what the purpose of that is, and then we'll just link that back into Horatio. Okay, so Shakespeare does this a lot through the tragedies, especially in kind of the Roman tragedies, and arguably the point in either having servants literally dying alongside their masters, or in Horatio's case, trying to, is that it shows the nobility of the master, essentially. It shows the nobility of those who also die, and it kind of heightens them as a tragic hero at the end, and it kind of heightens the tragedy overall. So you get it in various places, sort of Antony and Cleopatra. You have various the servants kind of dying alongside there. In Julius Caesar, we have it happening. Obviously, you get Romeo and Juliet, where one dies and then the other. That's not quite master and servant, but it's sort of, you know what I mean. And here it's all about kind of heightening the tragedy. So whilst it's denied within Hamlet, the intention is still there. Okay, that's pretty much it, people. So hopefully these kind of recordings have given you an overview of towards the end of the play, and kind of filled in a number of the gaps. Then, as I say, I've only picked out bits. You need to be ready to approach an extract to be able to make the most out of whatever extract you're given. If I were to talk about every single line in the play, these things would take hours and hours and hours and hours. But whatever extract it is, you'd be expected to talk about it overall. So you know, whilst we've talked about some bits, make sure you've got annotations around the other bits. But hopefully that's easier now that you've got the kind of the basics in place. There are on the blog, there are a couple of articles that are potentially useful, kind of dying words in Hamlet, the importance of asides and things like this. So have a look at those. But you just want to be kind of now collecting together your kind of key quotations around Hamlet, based around debates within the play, and based around kind of key themes and aspects of the play, essentially. Thursday, Friday, I'll put up some stuff around the close of Gatsby to just fill in those gaps. And then as we look to kind of after Easter, I'll work out what I'm going to do at that point. Okay. Right. See you later for now, people.